This intro a little bit longer because I want to explain something, and it's regarding the big Halloween episode of Anything Ghost coming in late October. I'll give you the deadlines in a second, but a big announcement is I'm not going to accept works of fiction or poems, etc. this year. I'm going to stick with the Anything Ghost format. Personal paranormal experiences, aka ghost stories, or local ghost legends. And regarding the deadlines, I haven't really set them up yet. I usually want to release it a week before Halloween so everybody has time to listen to it before the great day is over. But actually, let me go grab a calendar. I'll put you on hold a sec and I'll be right back. Alright, thank you for holding. I'm going to release it on a Monday. Halloween's on a Tuesday. So I'll release it on Monday, October 23rd. And so you'd have to get me the stories no later than, if I'm going to read it, get it to me by October 15th. And if you're going to record it yourself, we'll say October 18th. How's that? Alright, so those are the deadlines. If you want me to read it, October 15th. And if you record it yourself, October 18th. And that'll get the show out by the 23rd. And I don't do a early release for the VIP group. I usually do that every episode, but at Halloween it's just so much work, I don't want to have to concern myself with getting the show out early. Alright, so those are the deadlines. Now let's get right back into Anything Ghost show number 238. We're going to lead off with a story from Leta in Greenville, Tennessee. It's a great story. It's called The GI House and the Burning Boy. I was born and raised in Wyandotte, Michigan, in a small house built in 1947. It had been part of a GI Bill to provide housing for the returning veterans of World War II. During the day, the house would be quiet and cozy, but this would disappear as soon as evening began. At an early age, I began seeing shadow figures all about the house, faces on the walls, whispered conversations, the TV turning off and on, and black beings that would stare at me. But the most terrifying figure of all was the little burned boy who lived in my closet. Almost every night he would come to visit me while I tried to sleep. At first I tried to pile stuffed animals on one side of my bed and hide behind them, thinking I had outsmarted the little boy. But he would only peek over the top and look down at me. He had third-degree burns on most of his body, and the sight of him would send me screaming till I was hoarse. Soon after seeing him, for the first time, the night terrors began. I learned to stay awake as long as possible, but sleep would overtake me in the small hours of the morning, sending me dreams of fire. In some, my room would be ablaze, and I would be trapped. In others, I would find myself in the burn unit of some hospital, in terrible pain and dying. In one, a shadow figure came into my room, doused me in gasoline, and set me afire. My screams would wake my parents, and they would find me drenched in sweat, shaking and exhausted. Soon I developed a phobia of fire. It caused me to check the heater and the oven compulsively for defects, and to cry to my mother when she lit a match to burn a candle or work the gas stove. They tried to help me by installing smoke detectors in every room and allowing me to sleep with the fire extinguisher, but it wasn't enough. To keep the entities at bay, my father finally resorted to circling my bed with crosses, telling me that whatever was in the house would have no power with me so protected. It seemed to work for a little while, but the activity came back, and so the crosses were abandoned. One night when I was 10, I was sitting up in bed reading. I looked at my clock and saw that it was 4 a.m. The house had been quiet so far, and as I had school the next morning, I felt it was finally safe to catch a couple of desperate hours of sleep. I placed my book on the nightstand. I was just about to turn off the lamp when something compelled me to look up at my doorway. There stood my mother, dressed in her favorite jeans, flannel shirt, and white Reeboks. She glared at me sternly and shouted, "Don't put that there!" I looked at her confused. Did she mean my book? The lamp? I started to ask what she meant and why she wasn't in pajamas, when I realized that I could clearly see the clothes hamper through her. She faded slowly away, and I spent the rest of the early morning too terrified to sleep. When the alarm finally went off, I made my way to the bathroom. I stopped when I came to my parents' room and saw that my mom was also getting out of bed to make breakfast and start the day. I was mulling over whether I should tell her about my strange visitor when I glanced over and noticed that her favorite jeans and flannel shirt were hanging on the doorknob of her door. I almost became sick as I stared at the clothing the entity had seen and emulated. The image burned itself in my brain. My mom in her pajamas getting out of bed, and those clothes there, while my stomach churned and tears stung my eyes. It was one thing to see shadow figures, but for an entity to take the image of a loved one made me fear it all the more. At 14, we moved into a new house in Tennessee, and I was finally free of that evil that lived in the GI house. When I got older, my father finally admitted that when I was just a baby, he had placed a tape recorder on the kitchen table and told spirits to speak into it. The next morning, they heard an angry male voice, but couldn't make out the words. It scared my mother so much, she ripped the tape out of the cassette and threw it in the garbage. It was shortly after that, my dad would be visited by a small man at night and hear the sounds of a party in the living room, clinking glasses, shuffling feet, and several conversations going on at once. The small man would come to the door of the bedroom and wave to my dad, saying,
"Come on, Ray. Come to the party with us."
He would continue until my dad would start to get out of the bed, and suddenly the sounds and the small man would disappear. This plagued him for years. We were also finally able to talk about the TV. It was an old-style TV with a warm-up that gave off the sound of static electricity when you turned it on. Almost every night, we would hear it coming on, and someone or something would use the remote to click through all the channels quickly, over and over again. One of us would get out of bed and start walking toward the living room, where it was, and it would turn itself off before we got to the room. We knew we were taking turns, as it were, to stop the TV, but were too afraid to acknowledge it while we were living there. I'm now 36, married and living in a quiet and peaceful house in Tennessee. Occasionally I still have sightings of ghosts, or will have a strange occurrence of foreknowledge that always comes true. They're never scary. But even after all these years, that GI house still occasionally haunts me. I still have trouble falling asleep after dark, and the thought of fire always fills me with an unspeakably deep dread. And next up to bat is Amberly from Topeka, Kansas. Haunted Kansas Townhouse. 2 years ago, my husband and our 3 children, Austin, who was 6 at the time, Evan 5, and Jackson 1, all lived in a 2-bedroom townhouse. Within a few months of us living there, our oldest child, Austin, started to suffer from night terrors, which she had never had before. It was very disturbing. But she never remembered them the next day. After researching night terrors, we knew that there was nothing we could really do except ignore them and hope she would grow out of them. However, things would start to get more weird. Objects, like keys and cell phones, would fall off the ends of tables and counters by themselves. TVs would turn off and on by themselves. And one night, we even heard what sounded like people whispering in our children's bedrooms. And when my husband went into their room to tell them to go to bed, they were already dead asleep. Our friends wouldn't sleep at the house because they said they would hear something in the basement. And through all of this, my husband remained skeptical. But that wouldn't last long. After months of little things happening and us ignoring it and acting like it wasn't happening, we had 2 very scary nights. The first night, we were all up late in the living room watching movies. Austin, our youngest child, Jackson, and myself went upstairs to go to sleep. This left my husband and middle child, Evan, sleeping in the living room. My husband woke up in the middle of the night and saw a shadow walking up the stairs. Thinking it was Evan, he sat up and said, "Evan, what are you doing? Evan, where are you going?" Evan then sat up behind my husband, sleepy and confused, and asked what was going on. The shadow walking up the stairs was not my son. My husband immediately got chills, but tried to tell himself that he was just seeing things. He didn't tell me this story right away out of fear of scaring me. 2 nights after that happened, my daughter, Austin, was sleeping on my bedroom floor, and I was sleeping in my bed. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw a shadow figure crouched down next to her. Thinking it was my husband, I asked him what he was doing. The shadow figure turned its head toward me and disappeared right in front of my eyes. I screamed, jumped out of bed, and turned the light on. All this commotion woke my husband up, and I told him right away what I'd seen. That was when he told me about his experience from 2 days earlier. Well, this was the breaking point for us. We had planned on buying a house eventually because we needed more space. However, this made us jump-start the process, and within a few weeks, we were in a new home. Things were peaceful after moving into our new home. We didn't experience any voices, things didn't fall off counters, and the biggest change of all was the fact that my daughter's night terrors stopped instantly. We have moved on from that townhouse, but what happened there still haunts my family, and the topic comes up from time to time. I'm not sure what it was in that townhouse, but whatever it was, I'm glad it stayed there and didn't follow us to our new home. It's a short story from Clementine in Tucson, Arizona. Body sitting in the chair. I have a story as told to me by my daughter Clementine, who is 5 years old. One night when Mommy and Daddy were asleep next to me, but I couldn't sleep. I was the only one up. It was very dark. I heard a noise in the room. I looked over at the chair by my mommy's desk and saw a white body sitting in the chair, staring at me with red eyes. I knew it was a ghost. I was too scared to move because it was looking right at me. I didn't know what to do, so I tapped Daddy on the shoulder to get me some water so he could wake up. I didn't need water, but I wanted Daddy awake. I was too scared to tell him about the ghost, but it was gone as soon as he turned the light on. It was very scary, and I will never forget the red eyes. This is from Grace in Yardley, Pennsylvania. My dog, Amber. My childhood home was built in the 1980s. When I was 3, I had a dog named Amber. Amber was very old. One night I was sick in bed, but was better by morning. I went downstairs that morning and found my parents talking, but I was unable to find Amber. I asked my mother where Amber was, and she told me she had died last night. I ran upstairs and cried. After a while, I felt a strange presence near me. I had been holding Amber's picture in my hand, and it felt like my hand was being licked, but of course there was nothing there. A few months passed, and I was afraid to sleep. I woke up one night feeling like I was being watched, and I looked up to see 2 yellow eyes. The eyes were small, and were the same color as Amber's eyes had been. After they disappeared, it never happened again. Every Day of the Dead I visit her grave and decorate it to show my appreciation for her love. 10 years have passed since she died, and now I'm 13. I still think of it all now. I believe it was her last goodbye. I never noticed spirits before that time, but now I see shadow people in my bedroom, and they just stare at me while I'm in bed. One night it was a bold figure, 3D-like, and very dark. And one night I saw a shadow of someone's head. I live on the 2nd floor, so unless a ladder is used, it is impossible to look through the window. I believe that someone is watching me, and that Amber is still with me today. And the next story is from Mandy in the UK. Haunted Abbey Wood House. My family, unaware, moved into a haunted house when I was 10 years old on New Year's Eve 1976. It was in Abbey Wood, southeast London, with the county of Kent just down the road. My family consisted of my mom, dad, older brother, younger sister, and brother. The house was an Edwardian terraced house set on a main road. At the time my parents bought it, it was in need of a lot of modernization, as it still retained all of its original features, such as fireplaces, bare floorboards, no central heat, no double glazing, and even an outside toilet. There were no bathrooms or toilet facilities in the house, and we would endure months of building work while this was being done. This first thing happened to my sister while my family and I took our dogs for our regular Sunday meetup with my nan and her dog at a nearby woods. Upon our return, my sister asked me if I had returned earlier and gone back out again. I assured her I had not. She then went on to tell me that, not long after, she heard us bundle out of the front door. She settled down in our bedroom to play with her dolls. The bedroom door was fully closed. As she sat playing, she heard the squeak of the door handle being pushed down. This made her look at the door, and then she saw the door opening. It only stopped when it got halfway, because the carpet's thickness prevented it from opening any more. At first she thought it was me or one of her other siblings playing a prank on her, so she called out, "Mandy, is that you?" No reply. "Bob! Andrew! Stop messing about!" Silence. I was very spooked by this. I had always felt I was being watched whenever I found myself alone in the house. From the day we moved in until the day we moved out to my own place at the age of 19. Another experience happened one evening when the whole family had settled down to watch Saturday night television together. My mom had forgotten her cigarettes upstairs in her bedroom and asked me to go get them and collect them for her. I didn't want to go upstairs on my own, as I always felt I was being watched or followed. But I dutifully did as she asked. As I approached the top of the stairs to come down, I heard a loud voice from behind me. I ran down those stairs 2 at a time and raced into the living room, expecting to see one of my siblings to be missing, only to find everyone present. They all looked toward me in surprise as I burst through the door, saying I looked like I'd just seen a ghost. Another memorable experience happened one Christmas night, after the whole family had settled down in their beds for the night. The house was quiet. I heard my brothers go to bed, my mom and dad go to bed, and close their bedroom doors. I then heard the light switches being turned off. Soon, I fell asleep, but only to be awakened by my sister, who was in the bed next to mine, whispering loudly, "Mandy, wake up! Mandy, wake up!" Over and over. When I came to, she whispered, "Can you hear that?" I listened, and to my surprise, I could hear people in the kitchen directly below our bedroom. We heard loud, happy voices and cupboards opening and closing, and the distinct sound of our cutlery drawer being opened and closed, and rattling all the silverware. Whoever it was making a real racket. I said, "It's probably the neighbors next door, making a midnight snack. Go back to sleep." I truly believed it was our neighbors in their kitchen, so I wasn't really afraid. Then, my sister said, "How come our back door keeps opening and closing?" And I realized she had a good point. My heart started beating loudly, almost hammering out of my chest. Our back door used to squeak really loudly when it opened and closed, and we got used to the squeak as my dad hadn't gotten around to oiling the hinges. After a while, we felt a little braver, so we snuck halfway down the stairs and peeked over the banisters down the hall to see if there was a light on in the kitchen, figuring it might be Mum or Dad. But when we looked in, it was dark, and all the noise had stopped. We rushed upstairs, woke up Mom and Dad, and insisted we had been broken into and that people were having a party in the kitchen. They just mumbled, "It's the neighbors. The walls are really thin." The next day I asked my neighbors if they had been up late the night before, and they assured me it wasn't them. And here's another self-recorded experience from Joe in the U.S. He sent us several before in the past, and this one's called Tampa Hotel Ghost.
This story takes place in March of 2002, and it starts in a small town in eastern Ohio where I live with my wife and 4 children on a 100-acre farm. My wife and I have been married for 38 years, and for over 40 years, one of the things that we enjoy doing is traveling together. So on this particular trip, what we did is travel down the West Coast, and then we go to the Keys, and we usually end up down in Key West, and we enjoy the sights, the Hemingway House, and hanging out down there in the Keys, and then we slowly work our way back up. Now, my wife and I, like I said, we've traveled together for a lot of years, and we're pretty efficient on how we do it. On this particular trip, as in others, what we do is we'll get a hotel by the airport, and we stay in, relatively nice hotels, and we'll just stay in a hotel that we'll drop off our car, and then a lot of these hotels have shuttles where they will take us to the airport the next day. And so what happened in this place is we got the room, and I went in, and we were getting set up to travel the next day. And what my wife does is she lays out the suitcases on the bed, and she starts, getting everything organized. And I think we ordered some food. I don't know if it was Chinese or a pizza or something. And I told my wife, I said, well, I'll go get the food. And she said, okay. So she was, packing, and I went outside and got ready to go. Well, when I got outside, I got a real unusual feeling, and it was like, boy, there's just something didn't feel right here. And I normally don't feel this way. We just came through the south side of Miami and some other places in Florida that they can be kind of rough, but where we were staying is kind of a nicer area. But I just had a funny feeling, and I thought, maybe I should just stay here. And then I thought, no, I ordered the food, I'll go. So I went and I got the food, and I came back, and we ate, and we went to bed. And I normally sleep good when I travel, but I just was really nervous for some reason. I just had a real weird feeling. I kept waking up and looking at the lights, and the room was kind of weird. It was a nice newer hotel, but there were marks all over the ceiling. I thought, I'm totally colorblind, and I thought maybe somebody had like a pizza fight or something, and there were like brown reddish marks all over the ceiling and on the wall. Anyway, I didn't think much of it, and we got up the next morning and got our shuttle, got to the airport, and everything was going good, and we were on the plane, and we were heading home. And my wife and I were talking, and we were talking about the trip and seeing our friends and business acquaintances that we had, missed. And my wife said, what do you think about that hotel room last night? And I said, I don't know. I said, that was kind of weird, wasn't it? Why? And she said, I had a real funny feeling there. And I said, what do you mean a funny feeling? And because she's an experienced traveler. She doesn't get shook up by too much, but she said there was something really weird in that room. And I got to thinking about it, because when we went to sleep the night before, she said, can you put the chair up against the door? And that was kind of unusual. And then she asked me, she said, do you have your gun? Well, I've traveled with a gun for 20-some years, and I always carry it with me. And I said, yeah, but it was kind of unusual for her to ask that. But like I said, I didn't think nothing of it, and I put the chair up against the door. But on the flight back, I said, why? And she said, it was really weird. She said, when you left to go get the food, she said she got real nervous, got a real funny feeling. And then she said she thought I walked past the door. She said somebody walked past the door, and she opened up the door, thought I was lost, and she said there was nobody there. And then she closed the door. So she was kind of spooked, and like I said, that's kind of uncharacteristic of her. But anyway, so we got back to Pittsburgh, got our car, came home, and the next day, getting everything organized and cleaned up, and I went down to my office, and I started doing some paperwork and things, and I was downloading my digital camera onto my computer. And the night, because we take a lot of pictures, and the night before we left in that hotel room, I had taken a picture of my wife standing next to the bed, And when I looked at the picture, there was a great big orb right above her head. Now, I'm not into the ghost scene or, research or anything like that. I mean, I have an open mind, and a lot of people are crazy about the orbs. I kind of an amateur photographer, and I see a lot of these people with these orbs, and I think this is lens flare or dust particles and things like that. So I'm not usually impressed by orbs in pictures, but this orb was different because it was a great big orb, and it was right over my wife's head where all these marks were on the ceiling. So I went upstairs and I told my wife, I said, this, you're not going to believe this picture. And I showed her this picture, and she just stared at it. She didn't know what to say. So anyway, we looked at it, and I thought, there's something going on in this place. I said, that's just really, between the weird feeling she had and this picture, it's like, this is crazy. So I went back to the office, and I got to thinking about it, and I called the hotel. And I got a hold of the check-in clerk, and I said, I told her my name. I said, we stayed there last week, or we stayed there 2 days ago, and I told her, I said, this is the room that we stayed in. I said, can you tell me anything about this room? And she said, what are you asking? And I said, was there ever anything weird that happened in that room? Has anybody that stayed there complained or made comments about the room? And she said, explain weird. And I said, I need to talk to the manager. So she went and got the manager, and I told him, I said, I stayed in the room. It was kind of a weird situation. I said, has anybody complained about the room or made comments about it? And he said, well, we had an incident in that room last week. And I said, what kind of incident? And he said, well, we really don't like to discuss it. And I said, hey, I'm just telling you, I'm calling from another state. I stayed there. What happened? And he said, well, we had a guy die in that room. And I said, are you kidding me? And he said, no. And I said, well, there's a lot of stuff all over that room. I said, I thought maybe it was pizza sauce or something. I said, was there blood, a lot of blood in there? And he said, yeah. He said, it was extremely violent. He said, and there was blood all over the room. I said, well, you need to get in there and clean that room because now it makes sense. I said, there's probably blood on the ceiling. I said, and it's a bad situation in the room. It needs to be cleaned. And he said, okay. And he was nice about it and everything, but I got off the phone and I told my wife, I said, there was a guy that was, murdered in that room a week before, and there was blood all over the room, and the guy said it was very violent. So, I don't know if you believe in ghosts or not, but that's just a strange thing, because to have those funny feelings, and then the orb, and then on top of that to find out there was a violent death in the room last week, that's a little bit weird. So, anyway... So that's my story, and we'll continue to travel. I don't know if we'll stay there again, but it was kind of interesting. Thanks for listening.
And Joe is an honorary member of the Anything Ghost VIP group. That means that for a one-time membership fee, he has access to the complete archives of Anything Ghost, plus an early release of each new episode, and there's other extras as well. So if you want complete access to the Anything Ghost archive dating back to that first release in January of 2006, then check out the Anything Ghost VIP group. Like I said, there's a one-time membership fee, and you can enjoy all the benefits. Check it out. Go to www.anythingghost.com and then click on the Join the VIP Group tab. Anythingghost.com, Join the VIP Group tab. It's a story from Taylor in North Carolina. Unwelcome guests. A few years ago, my family and I lived in a fairly new house in Cary, North Carolina. I was in the 7th grade at the time, so I was pretty young. I don't know how, but I knew from the start that something wasn't right with that house. We had a few paranormal incidents in that house, but there were a couple ones that really stood out. My parents both worked at the time, and I was the first to come home. For safety reasons, they would ask my grandfather to come and wait at the house until I got home. One day I came home to find my grandfather with a pale, frightened face, and as soon as I walked through the door, he got out of that house as quick as he could. I didn't know why until a little later. It turns out that he was sleeping on the couch when all of a sudden something grabbed his arm really hard and wouldn't let go. He freaked out and sat up, and it eventually let go. That same afternoon, I went upstairs to my room to do my homework. I was still alone at the house, but nothing ever really bothered me before that day. I was sitting at my desk, and my TV came on by itself. The remote was nowhere near me, so I knew it wasn't me accidentally pressing it. I kind of freaked out because I was home alone, so I just quickly turned it off and waited for my parents to come home. Another incident happened to my dad when we were coming home from an event late one night. We all got out of the car, but he stayed back to make a phone call. The rest of us went upstairs to change, and he came in not soon after. When we got back downstairs, he looked pale. He asked me if I had been standing by the door at any point before he came in. I was upstairs, so I said no. Apparently, he saw a figure of a young woman through the curtain that hung over the door just before he came in. He thought it was me trying to scare him, so he didn't really take it seriously until he opened the door to find no one there. The figure had disappeared and was only seen once again in a later incident. And this was a little funny incident that happened to Nick while he was in Thailand. He's from the U.S. It's not ghost-related, but it's anything ghost-related. This story isn't scary, but I thought it might make you laugh a little. I was in Thailand last summer, and me and my family stopped in a little massage parlor, and I got a foot massage. I had 2 earbuds in and was listening to anything ghost. To my surprise, the person giving me the massage asked me to give him one of the earbuds. I wasn't listening to music, but I didn't want to be rude, so I indulged him. When I handed him the earbud, the creepy opening to the theme started to play, and the person gave a confused smile, and then started to laugh. I was a little embarrassed because the creepy opening theme is now what that person thinks my taste in music is. I was waiting for your voice to come in so that he would understand that I was listening to a podcast and not my music. But right before you started to talk, he took out the earbud and gave it back to me. I hope you enjoyed my little story, and maybe you'll share it with your audience. Thanks for your time, Nick. And this is not really related to Nick's story, or it's not a ghost story, but I'm putting together a new book for Anything Ghost, and I sent out a bunch of emails to people wanting to use their stories, and quite a few of you didn't reply. I know some people don't want their story in a book, but check your spam. If you sent in a story, check your spam folder or anything. See if I sent you a notice about adding your story to my next book. All right, now let's get back into show number 238. A story from Noelle in Michigan. Pennies from Grandpa. My grandpa passed away in August of 2015, and my son was born in March of 2016. I named him George after my grandpa because he was a very special person. I wanted to honor him. He was very caring and really loved his family. My son and I go over to my grandma's house every day to keep her company, make her meals, and help her out however she needs. I have a pack-and-play for little George to nap in upstairs, in the only bedroom that has room-darkening shades on the window. Coincidentally, this happens to be the bedroom that my grandpa died in. George usually goes down for naps pretty easy, and wakes up cheerful and babbling like he's having a conversation with someone. I thought maybe he could see someone, but I can't. But he babbles a lot in general, so I wrote it off. Last week I was sitting in my bedroom trying to put little George down for a nap, but he was being very fussy and crying. My dad was outside doing some lawn work for my grandma. I had the door cracked open, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone wearing blue jeans and tennis shoes walk into the room and just stand there. I thought maybe my dad had come upstairs to see why the baby was crying, and I wondered how he came into the room so quietly. But when I looked up, there wasn't anyone there. Blue jeans, tennis shoes, and a plaid shirt were my grandpa's uniform. He wore something similar just about every day. I've also been finding pennies in some very obvious places where they shouldn't be at times when I'm thinking of my grandpa. The same day that I had seen the legs, I was back at home working in my vegetable garden. I have a little Japanese garden statue that used to belong to my grandpa. It was in my garden now. So I was thinking about him quite a bit while I worked. I looked down and saw a penny in the middle of the bed where I was weeding. I found the whole experience very comforting. I think he was just trying to communicate that he was still around and he was watching for us. And here's another self-recorded story. This one's from LP in the Santa Cruz Mountains of California. Blinking lights.
Hi, Lex and Anything Ghost listeners. I have a story to tell you. So, I have been fascinated by the supernatural and paranormal since I was a little girl, but I've never really had any experiences of my own. I've always just loved talking about it to other people and sort of collecting other people's stories. But very recently, I had my own first experience, and I'm really interested to see if anyone else has had an experience like this or if they make anything of it. So, I live in the Santa Cruz Mountains, about 10 minutes from town in a little neighborhood in the Redwood Forest. And my boyfriend and I moved into a cabin there almost 2 years ago. And it was a pretty big adjustment for us because we're not used to living in the woods, let alone living anywhere that has any sort of weather. And this last winter in Northern California was the wettest winter that we've had in 30 years. In Santa Cruz County, there were a couple of days where it rained so hard that every major road exiting the county had mudslide or multiple mudslides on it. And since we lived a little bit out of town, we lost power quite a few times during these storms. And that was sort of compounded by the fact that we don't actually have any cell phone reception where we live, and we have to have a cell tower. And so when the power goes out, everything goes out. I have no 4G, 3G, nothing on my phone. It's pretty much radio silence until you can drive into town, which was difficult because of the mudslides. So on this particular time, probably the worst storm, one of the worst mudslides of many to block the road that winter, we'd had the power out for probably about 3 days. And on the third day, we just decided we needed to go into town, use Wi-Fi. So on this particular night, it was probably about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and but in winter, of course, it was pretty much dusk. We had a bunch of battery-operated lights around the house, various things, flashlight, headlamp, and then some twinkle lights that were battery-operated. We had those on during the day. Since we live in the woods, even in the sunlight, even in the middle of summer, the house stays pretty dark inside because of all the trees. So we had these lights on all day, and as we were leaving the house, I went around and I shut off everything that I had it on with the batteries. We left the house, got back probably around midnight. I remember stepping out of the car and turning around and looking at the cabin, and every single window was flashing with yellow lights. And I was kind of shocked for a second. It looked something out of, like, demonic, out of a horror movie or something, and I I turned to my boyfriend and I said, "What the heck is going on here?" And he sort of just laughed and he's like, "Oh, you must have left some of the lights on." So we go inside and I see that, yes, the twinkle lights, which do have, solid on and then a blink mode, were on the blink mode. I sort of thought for a second, I could have swore I turned those off. I mean, I know I turned them off, but maybe my finger bumped them or something, and I sort of just put it out of my mind. I turned them on to the full power mode, since we were still without power. And I turned around and I see that my headlamp, which is sitting on the table, which I also remember turning off, was also on blink mode. And that was weird, because I know that I turned both of those off before I left. But I stopped for a second and I said, I must have just not been being careful enough, and I bumped the switches on them when I was turning them off. And I was sort of like saying this out loud to my boyfriend, and as I was discovering it. At this time, he just walks into the bedroom and he goes, "Whoa." He had a flashlight on the bed that was also on blink mode. And at this moment, I'm going, "Ghost, oh my God, ghost, ghost, ghost." And he's not really a big believer, or at least he's not as interested in this kind of thing as I am. And so he sort of just blew it off and said, "We must have just not been paying attention when you turned these batteries off." The next morning, the power came back on, which is always amazing and very exciting. And so I decided that I was going to go downstairs that next evening and do my laundry. Our laundry is in the basement, and the basement of our house can only be accessed from a door that's on the outside of the house. So you have to go around the house, walk down some very particularly creepy stairs. So I go down there, I have my laundry in my hands, and it is dark outside. And just as I approach the basement door, I see that there is a light coming out from underneath the door. And in the split second that I first see the light, I think, oh, well, we must have left a light on down there. And now that the power's come back on, the light is back on. But then I notice that the light is blinking. I had another pair of battery-operated blinking lights down in the basement because it's pretty dark down there and just sort of wanted to add some ambiance. But there's one detail about this that makes it so much more astonishing than the other lights. I had had these lights up for about a year, and about 4 months earlier, I went downstairs to the basement, went to go turn them on, and they wouldn't turn on. And I opened up the battery box, and the entire thing was covered in battery acid. And it takes 6 batteries to operate those lights. And so I pulled out all of the batteries that were covered in acid, leaving only 2 batteries in the box, just because I didn't want to deal with it and get my fingers dirty getting down to those last 2 batteries covered in acid. And the lights were wrapped around the whole room, and so I just sort of left them up even though they weren't working anymore and were completely out of commission. You can imagine my surprise walking down into that room, finding those lights on blink mode, and knowing that there weren't enough batteries in the box to operate the lights. I, instead of being scared, though, was just really excited because I have felt a certain presence in the cabin before, but I wasn't really sure if it was just my imagination or not. And anytime I would feel this presence, I would say out loud to it, "You can be here, but I don't want to know if you're here. And if you are going to show yourself, I don't want to be scared by the way that you do it." So I found it quite funny that my first paranormal experience at this house, or even in my life, was not really scary, but just more shocking and weird and surprising that I couldn't help but laugh at it. To follow up that story, my stepfather is a contractor and does a lot of electricity work. And a couple months later, I told him this story, and I asked him, is there any way, any weird electricity in the air because of the storms or lightning, or, is there phantom power or residual energy left over from the old batteries? Is there any way that those lights could have gone on by themselves without enough batteries in it to run it? And he told me absolutely no way. From all of his knowledge of electricity, it would not be possible to do. What's even stranger is that the lights had multiple modes on them, and to get to the blank mode, you probably had to press the button 4 or 5 times. That's my story. Not really sure what it means, but definitely pretty cool. Thanks so much, Lex. Love your show. Keep up the good work and take care.
And here are a couple stories from Rose in Elizabeth, New Jersey. South American Ghost Stories. Experience 1. My grandma owned a house with a lot of bedrooms. I think there were 7 bedrooms total. I'm from South American country. That's where the house was located. One day, my grandma decided to rent the very last bedroom facing our backyard to a very old lady. She must have been in her 90s. As kids, we used to make fun of her as she walked by. She never grinned or said anything. She never spoke to anyone. I remember she was very skinny. At night, when she returned, she used to walk a long hallway, dragging her feet in a manner that made a sweeping floor noise. The long corridor ended in our backyard, where her bedroom was. The corridor was inside our house, so we would always notice when she came home. She always wore these sandals, and when she dragged them, there was a noticeable noise. She also walked very slow. 3 months into the sublet, the lady passed away. She did not die in our house, but we heard from the neighbors that she had died at one of her relatives' homes. Even though she had passed away, every night we would hear her steps and noise from her sandals crossing that corridor. This lasted over 4 months. Every night we heard her steps. And then one night, we didn't hear it anymore. That's when we knew she was at peace. I also remember that during those times when we heard the strange steps, none of us had the courage to open the bedroom doors to look into the corridor. We were all too scared. Experience number 2. I was already in my 30s, married with 3 kids, and we decided to move to a quiet neighborhood in Elizabeth, New Jersey, called the Bayway area. One particular night, I decided to sleep in one of my daughter's rooms. All my kids were spending the night at my grandma's house. Me and my husband were spending the weekend alone. But this particular evening, I wanted to get away from my husband's loud snoring. As I was facing down, my head always sideways on the pillow, I was fully awake. I felt a powerful hand starting to push my face into the pillow until it was halfway into it. This felt like 2 hands with a strong force that obviously wanted to suffocate me. I remember running out of air and panicking so much because I couldn't breathe anymore as my face was being pushed down into the pillow. After something like 3 minutes of my face being pushed, the hands let go of my head, and I was able to turn my face and breathe. I immediately got up and looked around the room. Of course, there was no one in the room, and it was just me. I turned on the lights, and the entire house seemed quiet and peaceful. I then went to the master bedroom to wake up my husband and told him what had happened. He got up and got really scared too, as he believes in the paranormal. On a separate night, I was sleeping in that same room, and I felt as if someone with soft, warm hands touched both of my feet. As I immediately opened my eyes, there was no one in the room. I moved out of that house after like 2 years. I remember I was having all kinds of health problems, so I thought the house was making me ill. We moved to a new house in the same town, but a different area, only to find that whatever entity was tormenting me in the old house had moved with us to the new place and was planning all kinds of scary moments for us. And a story from Nathan in the U.S. Trapdoor Attic Ghost. I know you don't typically like to have a story sent in that didn't specifically happen to the sender. However, I thought you might be interested in this story that happened to my mother and her two sisters in around 1937. My mom's people were country farm people who lived in Kentucky in the 1930s. During the Depression, my mother's dad, hearing of work in Pennsylvania, left his wife and 3 small daughters, hopping trains and hitchhiking to Pennsylvania. He found a job in Clearfield, Pennsylvania, and settled in. After saving enough money, he purchased a small, 1-floor, 4-room house with electricity, but no running water or toilet. But it did have an outhouse in the backyard. After his purchase, he sent money for his family to join him. My grandmother and 3 young girls set off on the journey to a different home and a different life. A coal-cooked stove in the kitchen and a wood stove in the main room was all there was for heating the house for those cold Pennsylvania winters. The girls hauled water from a well, fed the chickens, tended the garden, picked apples, did household chores, and went to school. Being that the little house only had 4 rooms, after the kitchen and the main room, that left a bedroom for my grandparents and a bedroom for all 3 girls to share. My mom and her 2 sisters all slept in the same bed, putting the youngest in the middle. With piles of quilts and blankets to keep them warm. Being that the 2 bedrooms were at the back of the house, they got next to no heat in the bedrooms. The family noticed, almost immediately, that around the same time, several times a week, they would hear what sounded like a car drive up the dirt and gravel driveway in the front of the house. The car would stop, and this was followed by the sound of feet walking up to the back of the house. But no one was ever there. In addition to this, in the girls' back bedroom, on the ceiling, was a trapdoor attic that opened into a storage area, not much bigger than a crawlspace. Almost every night, as the 3 girls were trying to sleep, they would hear what sounded like a cat jumping down and landing on all 4 paws on the top of that trapdoor. That noise was followed by the room getting much colder, and the feeling that something had come into the room with them and sat down on the edge of the bed where they lay. My grandfather went up into the crawlspace several times to check for a cat or other animals that might be living up there, but they never found any evidence of anything being up there. After a while, they all just got used to the sound and basically ignored and lived with it. Eventually, all 3 girls grew up, married, and had children of their own. The oldest sister, Madge, moved to Ohio after marrying, and my grandparents eventually moved to Ohio as well. They rented out the little 4-room place that we had lived in. My mother, Maxine, and our youngest sister, Margaret, married and remained in Clearfield for the rest of their lives. Margaret and her husband purchased the house directly beside the little house they all grew up in and raised their children. One night, noticing a bright flickering coming from across the yard, reflecting through the windows, she looked out to find the little house ablaze with fire. The house went up quick. Nobody was hurt. It was said that the renters had left a can of kerosene close to a wood stove and it caught fire. But the story does not end with the house burning down. My grandparents, knowing they would never be returning to Clearfield to live, gave the property of that little house to my mother. My mother, having no use for it, gave it to her sister, since she owned the house on the property adjoined to it. Several years passed, and two of Margaret's young sons, my cousins, and a couple of neighborhood friends decided they wanted to build a camp. They scavenged the neighborhood, finding pieces of wood and whatever they could find to build the camp. They noticed a few pieces of salvageable wood laying in the foundation of the old burned-down house that had not been burned too badly, and so they took it as well and began their building. After the camp was complete, the boys decided to have a sleep out in the camp overnight. My aunt saw no harm in this, as technically they were just across the yard. As the boys settled in and started to fall asleep, they were suddenly awakened by the sound of an animal jumping on the roof of the camp. Bravely, my cousin unhinged the door and with his flashlight began scanning the roof of the camp. He saw nothing there. Thinking whatever it was had gone away, they made another attempt to sleep, only to have the same sound of something jumping and landing on its feet on the roof of the camp. Thinking now one of the other neighbor kids was playing a joke, they all came outside to find once again there was nothing around to make that sound. The four boys became scared and all went back to their homes for the night. The next morning, when my aunt asked her son why they had not slept out all night in the camp, my cousin told her what had happened. She thought about it a bit. She had never told him about the trapdoor ghost, and she remembered that some of the lumber they had used from the camp from the old house. She then told him about her experience as a child in the house, and that they heard the exact same thing. My cousin, after hearing the story, promptly went outside in the morning and tore down the camp that they had built and threw all the lumber back in the old foundation. Madge passed away 12 years ago. My mother, Maxine, is 90 years old now, and her sister Margaret is 86. For as far back as I can remember, and to this very day, my whole lifetime, as well as my siblings and cousins, my mom and her two sisters would tell and retell this story, and all three always claimed it was absolutely true. Okay, everybody, the next story I have is the last story, and it's a self-recorded one, and it's from Joseph in, I got it here somewhere, Mount Forest, Ontario, Canada. Sunderland Ghost.
My name is Joseph, and my family and I, my wife and our 4 kids, live in Mount Forest, Ontario, Canada. However, about 13 years ago, we bought a century home that we lived in for around 5 years. And it was in a small town north of Toronto, Ontario, called Sunderland. Now, the home that we bought was a 2.5-story Victorian red brick house. 2.5 stories insofar as it had a partially finished attic. And the attic had windows, and the house looked like a spooky old haunted house. It was on an acre of land. As soon as we moved in, everybody in town told us, this house is haunted. You've got ghosts in your house. I was a bit of a cynic back then. My wife really wanted to believe in ghosts so badly that just made me kind of overcompensate, and I was even that much more of a cynic because she just wanted so badly to see something or believe something was in our house. And so she'd tell me from time to time I'm hearing noises or I saw something strange, and I would just kind of disregard it because I knew that she was very biased in favor of finding ghosts. The first night that we stayed in the house, however, there was something that I was in denial about, but I just could not dispute. And that was, my wife and I stayed, the day we moved into the house, we decided to stay in the house and sleep there. We set up our bedroom. And we left our kids with my in-laws the grandparents, because the logic was we wanted to set up their rooms and unpack everything first. So when the kids came up to the house the next day, it wouldn't be such a culture shock for them. Everything would be unpacked. So we were laying in bed and just dozing off after a hard day of heavy lifting and moving all sorts of boxes and luggage into this new house. And we could hear smacking and cracking and footsteps and door handles and all sorts of sounds throughout the house, creaking and floorboards and you name it. Several times I got up out of bed, ran down the hall, ran downstairs because I thought there must be some neighbors messing with us, or maybe some local kids thought they would have a bit of fun with the new owners of the house. We were hearing sounds such as footsteps coming up the front porch outside to the front door, the sound of the door handle moving, and then the steps continuing in the house up the stairs, and they'd go right to the doorway of our bedroom. After a couple of hours of this, I had gotten out of our bed so many times to investigate these noises in the darkness that I said to my wife, I don't care what we hear the rest of the night, I'm just not getting out of bed. And the noises stopped. Now, over the months as we were living there, something did occur that was very strange, which was this. I started to hear voices from time to time in the house. So, for example, one day I was alone in the house. I was listening to Christmas carols, and I was sitting in the bath and reading a book. It was a snowy winter evening, and above the carols, in the hallway outside the bathroom, I could hear men's voices, as though there were 2 or 3 guys speaking with very deep voices right outside the bathroom door. The door was open because I was home alone. My wife and the kids were down at the grandparents'. And so I would get out of the bath and I would turn down the CD player that at the time was playing the Christmas carols, and the voices would stop. And then as soon as I turned the CD player back up again and I would get in the bath, I could hear the voices again. In fact, when I first heard them, I thought, somebody's in my house. Maybe there's firemen or somebody who've come into my home because there's an emergency. Why would there be grown men in my hallway outside my bathroom door? So a couple of times I had to get out of the bath and turn the volume down, and then I thought, okay, either I'm hearing things or something is happening in this house that is messing with me. And there were other occurrences. My wife and I both started to compare notes because when we were watching TV in our master bedroom, at least 3 or 4 times a minute, out of the corner of our eye in the doorway of the bedroom that led out into the hall, we would see these shadowy figures blink by, and that's the best way I could describe it, blink by the bedroom door. And so you would scratch your eyes and think, is there an eyelash in my eye? What's going on? Is there something in the corner of my eye that I keep seeing this dark shadow blink or flutter by the doorway? And what would happen is as soon as you looked directly at the doorway, you wouldn't see them. But out of the corner of your eye, you could see them. And so this happened quite frequently, and it started to increase. In other words, the more we saw them, the more frequently they would appear. And one time my wife and I were watching TV in the bedroom, and we were talking about this, and she was saying, I'm seeing them, and I said, yeah, I'm seeing them too. And then one of the shadowy figures blinked by the door very quickly, and before I could say anything to my wife, she said to me, did you see that one? And I said, yeah, I did. I was just about to ask you if you saw it. So it wasn't just me seeing it. It couldn't possibly be something in my eyes. Our children started telling us that they were seeing a little girl in white pajamas in the house. And that really started to spook us. One evening, I was watching television at about 11 o'clock at night in our living room downstairs, and my children were all tucked up in bed, and my wife had gone to bed, and I was alone downstairs just watching television, and off the corner of the banister, I could see through the upstairs banister because there was a foyer in the Century home. From where I was sitting in the living room, I could see out the doorway to just the top of where the stairs turned around, cornered, and went towards my daughter's bedroom. And at the top of the banister, out of the corner of my eye, I see a blonde-haired little girl in pajamas leaning over the banister. Now, both my daughters were blonde-haired. So as soon as I saw this out of the corner of my eye, I said, "Get to bed," because I thought it was one of my daughters peeking over to see what Dad was doing. And the little figure very slowly leaned back out of my vision. Now, what I normally would hear if one of my daughters was at the top of the stairs is I would have heard their footsteps because it was an old creaky house, and I would have heard her footsteps go back to the bedroom, which was directly above the living room, and I would have heard the bed springs as she got into bed, but I heard nothing. After I said, "Get to bed," and the little blonde figure leaned back over the banister, I heard nothing. So I got up. I proceeded to start to stand up from the couch because I thought, one of the girls is standing at the top of the banister just outside of my vision. She obviously hasn't gotten back into bed yet. So I go to stand up, and just as I do, the little blonde figure comes flashing, sliding down the stairs in a flash, in a standing position as though the stairs are an escalator. Without going up and down as though she's stepping downstairs, she glides down the stairs. And immediately I jump because I'm thinking one of my kids has just come down the stairs, probably skiing down on her heels, and has fallen at the bottom. And I get up and I run out to the foyer, and there's nobody there. There's no little girl. But as clear as day, I saw this figure gliding quickly down the stairs, and then it occurred to me it made no noise. This little girl who glided down the stairs made no noise, no thumping, no bumping, no creaking, no sliding on her heels, nothing. She glided down the stairs and vanished. And I run out into the foyer, nobody's there, and a chill runs up my spine, and I realize this house is haunted. There is definitely something going on here. Shortly thereafter, my wife had been for some time suggesting that we get these mediums to come in and cleanse the house. We also had a priest bless the house, and we're a very spiritual family. So we're a family of prayer. We have a lot of religious artifacts and crucifixes in the house. We bless the house ourselves quite frequently and smudge it. So we never ever felt unwelcome. We never felt an evil presence. There's many times I stayed alone in that house while my wife took our kids down to the grandparents and visited. I never felt unwelcome in the house or that something was menacing, but definitely the house was haunted. And so after that incident with the little girl, that's when I said to my wife, yes, I think we should get these mediums to come in and cleanse the house, which we did. The mediums came in, there was I believe there was 3 of them if memory serves. They came into the house. They did not want to know any details up front. They said, don't tell us anything. Let us do what we have to do, and we will tell you. And they spent, I think a few hours going room to room, cleansing the house. And then they came back and they told us what they found in terms of ghosts in the house. There was a little girl in the house. There also was a gentleman in the house who was an elderly gentleman, spirit, who they said was very fond of our children and was very much in approval with how we were raising our kids, but they said he's grown too fond of them. He's too close to them. And so they asked him to leave. Now, interestingly, they would take no money for their services. When we asked them if they wanted something for their time that they spent cleansing the house, they said, just give us perhaps $20 for gas. And that was it. They did not want to be paid because they felt that would betray the intent and purpose of what they did. After they left, we never experienced any happenings in the house again. It just had a general sense of spaciousness and light and cleanliness, and the house just felt legitimately cleansed. However, that was our experience with our haunted house in Sunderland, Ontario. We've gotten a lot of mileage out of many of the stories of our experiences there, and I can genuinely say that I definitely was converted in terms of my belief in ghosts.
And that's it for Anything Goes show number 238. Again, if you have a story to share, send it to lex@anythinggoes.com. And remember the Halloween deadlines from earlier in the show. And don't forget about the Anything Goes VIP group. For a one-time membership fee, you'll have complete access to the Anything Goes VIP archive,